Yeah.
Right, okay. So thank you everybody for coming along, and clearly we're coming towards the end of the project, and I think there's a few things we just wanted to do before we came to the end. I think the first thing is obviously to go through what we have found, and I suppose like other academics, we don't just want to do a project and then disappear. So there's obviously questions of us seeking additional funding, finding other ways to keep this going. Everybody in this room is passionate about art for reconciliation, and I think that's something which doesn't get as much currency in society as it should have. I think there's a massive contribution that's been made. Obviously, like anything else, some of it good, some of it better, but I do think it has shaped and framed. And other research work I do, that change in society where people have felt included, or they have been able to represent their issues, or they have felt through art that something's represented how they feel about the place and how it is changing as well. I think also, despite ongoing difficulties, we have transformed this society, irrespective of your constitutional or identity background. It's a much better place, and art's been very important in holding and representing and engaging in very difficult issues that we all live through. I think that's important as well. But I suppose that there's a couple of questions today that we really just want to ask you, because you're the experts and you've been the people who've really helped us do this. Is first of all, what's your reaction to what we have found? The second thing is this of any use to you? Or how could these findings be made useful for you? I would like to think when you're applying for your own grants, etc., in the future, that we could be, I don't necessarily partners, but most certainly we could be people who legitimize or ratify what you do and the good work and the good intentions within it as well. But so I suppose there's a couple of questions then also around. We're going to meet the minister in a few weeks' time, and what would be the recommendations you would like us to put forward? What needs to change? And Alex and Pauline could go through this now. So basically, what we're looking for is not just a research project where we disappear, write our academic articles, and we get the benefit out of it. We'd like to think of this as a continuing relationship. What value is the research to you? What value is us being involved with you now for future projects and future activities? And what it is that you'd like us to convey to the minister? And in that essence, I suppose, what is it you would like to see changed? What are the issues that need to be looked at and to be understood by the minister? So Pauline and Alex have been wonderful colleagues and have worked very hard and have done some really good work. And since February, March, we've been working up these papers on what impact is and what the research says and what it should mean for policy, etc. So I shall go quiet, which is always a good thing, and I will pass on to Alex, and Alex will take you through the first part of the presentation. Then, so it doesn't get too long, we'll have some questions around Alex's presentation, comments, questions. And Pauline will speak, some comments, questions, and then we'll get into those big questions that we've just raised, okay? So thank you very much for coming along. Alex.
Can everyone see my shared screen there? Just full screen it. Does everyone see that?
Yeah.
Looking good.
So David will be familiar with bits of this because we've given this presentation before just amongst ourselves, but this is kind of my take on the project, but also it's me trying to represent the collective work that everyone has done, including yourselves, on this project. And I can't claim that it's entirely representative. We've taken on, I think, a huge question and a huge issue that is very difficult to summarize in a kind of 15-minute presentation, which is precisely why I think it's important that we sort of think about ways we can continue responding to some of the issues raised over the last few years in this project. So the theme, I guess, of this paper is what an informed art for reconciliation strategy might look like. And it's structured around a series of questions about what it currently is informed by, or at least, or not informed by. And I'll try and end with a few suggestions, perhaps, which I kind of have tried to keep as open as possible so that we're not too prescriptive. So to allow some more debate around what those what sort of recommendations might emerge out of the project. And then Pauline's going to talk a bit more about collections, which is an important issue as well, which relates to this. So the first issue that the project really encountered when it began, before I started on it actually, was the question of where is all the art? So what information is currently recorded on funded art projects that are engaged with peace-related issues? Now, this relates to the collection stuff that Pauline's talking about, but what we found, to sort of summarize, is that it's very difficult really to gauge precisely how much money has gone to art-specific projects because of the manner in which they're recorded. So on the one hand, you've got no specific data or subcategory of data relating to the arts in peace-related funding. But when you search carefully through existing databases, as our colleague Pete Campbell and Sarah Jankovic did, you find approximately 5 to 6% of funding from various bodies goes towards arts-related activities. But that's, again, it's an estimate because the data is so patchy. And so the question of informing arts policy, it's very difficult even to establish what's being funded already in terms of whether it's an arts project or just a generic, another kind of peace-related project. And in terms of where the art is in a kind of material sense, it's quite difficult to find a lot of archival evidence of these projects. And this is something that Pauline will talk about, and we've tried to sort of think about in structural terms and something we've recently written. But although quite a lot is held by various institutions, it's hard to kind of gather it together under the theme of peace building art or peace-related art, or as we call it, art for reconciliation. So if you're a researcher or a practitioner who's interested in this field of activity and practice, it's very difficult really for you to know where to begin with what's happened already. So this is one big, I think, limiting factor, maybe the biggest limiting factor to developing any kind of cohesive strategy. And it's important to note that this is kind of a consequence of there being no, in policy terms, clear strategy of art for reconciliation. So the location of the arts within peace building is something that isn't really written about in terms of policy, whether that's by big funders like the CRC or SEUPB, or as a part of TBUC, the kind of definitive document from 2013 on peace building. There isn't really a specific idea of what the arts is doing within the peace building strategy in general. So that's a kind of negative finding. So we're going to move on now to a different kind of a process of informing, which is funder evaluation. So this is something that we've talked about quite a lot in our project over the years, about how evaluations understand the value of the work that's been done in arts and peace building. So how is it measured? There are lots of different methodologies, and I think it's important to note that there is no single methodology, but there's broad tendencies towards certain kinds of information. So I've kind of tried to sum them up here. So broadly speaking, there will be a set of aims that would be usually dictated by a broad art strategy and by the ACNI, or depending on what kind of project's being commissioned. And these will be measured through sometimes interviews, attitudinal surveys, distant travelled surveys, and economic impact, which is increasingly important. The main issue, I think, actually, more than these specific kind of forms of data collection, are how is it analysed? So how do you treat this information? And the big problem that we've identified is that it doesn't really get analysed in a way that you can recognise as a method of analysis. So when you're an academic, obviously you look at interview data, you don't just take it and say this proves that this has been achieved. You say this is rich, linguistically rich, contextually rich information that we need to analyse very carefully. I think the problem, and it's a structural problem as well, because a time and resourcing problem, which is that evaluations often, evaluators don't have time to really do that work. So what happens is the exercise of evaluation just becomes an exercise in proving that you've achieved these set aims by selecting information such as quotes from interviews or data that kind of will simply be attached to a particular outcome in advance. So you can already see that there's several issues with this form of using data in a kind of fairly uncritical and transparent way. So I'll kind of go into some of those. So textualization. So this is on the right, you have kind of how data is presented sometimes. So this is in the re-imaging communities evaluation, which is for the Arts Council. And this is useful information, but it's presented without much comment on forms of gathering, like potential limitations, positive bias, these kinds of things. So, the reliability of that information is interesting and rich, but doesn't really have the context that gives it meaning and allows people to really get to grips with it. And there's a lot of research on this in particularly in the applied arts and applied arts research. And one of the kind of key things that I think a lot happens in evaluation is that the context of a particular project and of the respondent as well, your biography as a respondent, is usually not present in these evaluations. And there's a quote there which I think is quite useful, but the bit highlighted in red, we shouldn't just treat people's feedback as a kind of transparent slice of reality, but we should look at it as giving us information on how people value the arts and the frameworks of understanding that people use to value the arts. So why is it that a particular person might find a project unappealing or not, or off-putting or not for them? You can only really understand that with the context of that person's particular community, where they're from, how people from that background understand the value of the arts. So that kind of research hasn't really been done, and often it means that we don't really understand what a negative or positive finding actually means in terms of targeting future projects or anything like that. And you can see the limitations here. This is an interview that I conducted with and someone who is a researcher and an evaluator for the Theatre of Witness project. Actually, this is someone who's worked on both sides of that divide. And they say that, this idea of participant agency and the fact that people's feedback is going to be used to prove an outcome regardless of what they actually say. I think that's important. All this rich context and information isn't treated as informative. It's kind of taken just as a kind of as evidence that something's been achieved. And why is that important? Well, we all, in the context of Northern Ireland, it's very important because people's class background, political background, identity, whatever, informs the way that they understand arts. And of these perceptions of who the arts are for and why a certain group of people or individual will and will not engage with reconciliation projects just becomes a footnote in an evaluation rather than a defining feature of an arts project. So you have in the re-imaging communities project these contextual challenges, political, environmental and community tensions, by which they mean the flags protests, I think, in 2013. This becomes a kind of limiting factor rather than the context of a project. So this rich context that gives meaning to feedback isn't really understood as probably one of the most important aspects of any kind of arts project. It affects the devising and also the outcome of the project. So and as I say, it's particularly important in Northern Ireland, where attitudes to the arts are politicized historically. I take a quote there from a playwright that I interviewed a few years ago. It's a cliche, but it gives us a sense that certain groups of people have a history of engaging with the arts for certain reasons and in certain ways, and that's often left out of arts policy. It's not informing these projects at the level of policy and at the level of allocating funds. And also a big thing, and you're in there, I'm afraid, is a big thing that was often missed off in these projects is the short-term, a big limitation of evaluation is its short-termism. So this is something we're addressing with some of our case studies, but it's a simple issue that because funding and multiple pots of funding that are being juggled by arts organisations often are time limited, and evaluations have to take place in response to the particular temporal priorities of a funder, that the longer term legacies of individual projects, the ability of that project to really reach wider audiences beyond the term of, beyond the 4 years or whatever that project existed, is not really recorded at all. And it certainly doesn't inform how arts funding works. So, I mean, there's a lot of text on this, probably should have cut this down a bit. But one of the big things that's not really ever talked about is that you may have an arts project that exists for 2 or 3 years, and then participants go out and try to amplify the message of that arts project, as Anne herself has done. But you really come up against lots of barriers that may relate to your own capacities, the fact that you may or may not have an independent income as somebody who wants to be a facilitator, the fact that the locality you're in might not have a history of drawing down funding for peace building. So there's lots of contextual factors that aren't really understood as being part of impact in an evaluation that may affect the long-term legacies of a project. So essentially, in broad terms, it's how does that project fit in with the broader structural problems facing peace building in the North of Ireland, and how we can sort of start thinking about joining those two, the longer term things, longer term structural issues with these shorter term projects. How can we join these two things together? And in some ways, there is a broader context, which researchers call the neo, which we might argue is, I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but it's this kind of understanding of peace as coming before or being a precursor to economic development. So if you have a project in a particular area, it's understood as securing the ground for economic development. And in some ways, the language that frames peace building, such as the TBUC, it foregrounds economic issues rather than understanding those economic issues as being part of the barrier, a barrier you might face as a peace builder to getting people involved in a project. It's seen as a consequence of peace building rather than as bound up in the peace building. And you see this in our interviews where people talk about the limitations of what a single project can do in a context where you're facing huge structural barriers. So there needs to be a better understanding of what the arts can do and cannot do in this broader context. Yes, I think I'll move on. So what does inform arts practice? Well, artists do a lot of work that perhaps funders themselves need to learn a bit more about. So the context that we often see missing from evaluations and from arts policy documents, that's the context you have to deal with as an artist, particularly as if you're a practitioner who's working with a particular group of people. It's ethical questions that are actually central to whether a project is appropriate for the group that it is hoping to enlist or target or hoping to attract. So these questions around the political and economic circumstances of a particular community and how that might impact on people's ability to engage with the arts and with a particular project. Why a certain group views the arts with suspicion, and sort of ways that might be more tailored forms of measurements depending on where a particular project is taking place. And ethical questions: is a particular facilitator or practitioner qualified to really engage with a group of people who have experienced certain things, that practitioner might not have experienced? When is an outsider practitioner actually preferable, which is something that is, I think, has definitely been the case in the past. So these kinds of questions aren't really asked when a project is being evaluated necessarily. A lot of this information is either pushed to the side of the broader aims. It's like a marginal feature of evaluation. So I think these questions are central to practitioners as they engage with certain communities. And we can see this in our interviews. So we interview here an anonymous where not. The questions they asked that they didn't feel were asked in the evaluation. So the qualification artists have, that they're, what qualification do they have to engage in this kind of work? Political awareness, people understand cultural politics, particularly important, obviously, in Northern Ireland. So how people are equipped to, and whether their project is appropriate. These questions are really important, but are often marginal or not present in the current logic behind allocating and evaluating projects, allocating funds and evaluating projects. There's another example here from David Boyd, where he talks about how long it takes to engage and enlist people in a project like Beat Carnival. Good relations across the city are very important, and that takes a long, long time. And one of the fantastic things about our interviews is they really show the work that has been done, really, to get people involved in these projects. And he talks about engaging the Short Strand in an East Belfast project. It took 3 years. It's very, these circumstantial and very local issues are important for artists, but are often, again, missed off by in the allocation of funds or in the evaluation of projects. So this is the sort of stuff that should inform, we would argue, an art for reconciliation funding and strategy that perhaps isn't as central as it should be at the moment. Yes, and longevity suggests perhaps that there needs to be a kind of longer term picture. So what we mean by strategy is also a temporal thing, where we think about what longer term support might look like. Appropriate measures, I've already talked about this, so I'm probably not going to go through every point here. But what is it about a particular project strategies? The example of Theatre of Witness in Derry. What was it about using theatre that was appropriate to deal with these issues and storytelling? Why is this? And often there'll be a very clear idea of this, of the appropriateness of this particular artistic strategy that doesn't feature or that isn't shared in the documentation. So, talking to any artist, they'll be very clear about their ethical and strategic kind of reasoning behind using testimonial theatre, for example. But that needs to be clearly articulated, I think, to give people an understanding of what things do actually work, what methods do work, without gathering, currently there isn't information on specific methods that have been adapted and successfully used. So I think that's a very important oversight as well. So to close off, I suppose, the final slide here, what can we do? Well, what can change? And I think the main thing is to have an art for reconciliation strategy, to actually use the term art for reconciliation, or maybe a better term, art for peace, whatever we think is more politically appropriate perhaps, and talk about that in strategic terms, either as a subsection of arts funding or as a subsection of peace funding, or both, but it needs to be considered as a cohesive strategy to start off with. So I guess the question there is, who gets to decide on what the strategy is? And I think that one of the biggest takeaways from our project is how productive it can be if you bring artists, audience members, experienced facilitators, participants, people who become facilitators who originally were spectators and participants into the same room to talk about what a strategy might look like. And currently that doesn't exist. That forum doesn't exist within the current system. And that leads to lots of issues around people feeling like arts funding is essentially allocated in a disciplinarian way, where you're constantly under surveillance to make sure that you hit targets that you have had no say in deciding. So we need to bring together the expertise of funders in thinking around big strategic kind of macro level, and the experiences of artists, participants, facilitators, and perhaps creating a forum in which those people can meet and discuss things together. But in broad terms, there needs to be a clearer sense of what art for reconciliation strategy there are out there, and artists are the people who can, and facilitators are the people who know that. So you need those people in the room for a strategy to work. And also a great discussion of the broader structural limitations that allow you to think about what the arts can and cannot do, because the arts aren't a surrogate for the state, right? They shouldn't be just doing things that the state perhaps should be doing in terms of, all the things the state probably should be doing that they aren't currently doing. So yeah, that's, I suppose, the kind of broad shape of our recommendations. That's not entirely, and we really want you to kind of give them a bit more shape and respond really to that. So yeah, I hope that was helpful.
Okay. Have we any immediate questions or issues that anybody would like to raise?
I have a couple of thoughts as well.
Then Kim,
Kim, do you want to go ahead?
No, Anna, you go first and then Kim. Okay.
Listening to a whole lot of things stood out for me and how difficult it is. And you see, coming from a place where I do something that I know works, interested in looking at or just commenting on the fact that the Playhouse and Peace Building Academy type methodology is transferable. It's really transferable across the board, not just here, but in other countries and other situations. And it just dawned on me, would it be interesting? Because what happens is we bring people from diverse backgrounds together over a period of time, and those diverse people storytell in an artistic way, but then use their stories in an educational type way to diverse audiences, be it communities or schools. And it just struck me, I wonder, could we transfer that to artist situations from different backgrounds and coming from different angles, and put a methodology on that brings that into the public forum to diverse audiences? Is one of my big phrases at the minute, is it's not what you know, it's what you don't. And I keep coming back to the time I did I did a course with the University of Ulster, and we went visiting the museums. It was an arts course, and it was 50. It was the first time I'd ever seen Girl in a Bomb Blast. And I should have seen that in my life at some stage. And I'm conscious of the fact that whenever art is in museums and in secondary schools and even older than that, because I wanted to go to York Street, I could tell you about Da Vinci and Leonardo, but I couldn't tell you about any of our local Northern Irish artists. I couldn't. So if I don't know that, then teenagers don't know that. People in their 20s don't know that, because there isn't a platform for them other than museums and art galleries. And unless you're going on a school project or a course, the chances are a certain type of people go to those places. And just like theatre of witness, certain type of people will go to a theatre and sit and watch a performance. But what we did was we then took it out into the communities, and that's where it really impacted. Would it be worth looking at transferring that, in essence, bringing art right out of the galleries and right out of the museums, from to the public, to all of the public, but specifically from every background, and from an artist's point of view, to every background from a public point of view? Just getting that thought out there.
Firstly, thanks, Anne. I totally agree with you, and I think there's an awful lot of art out there that should be out in the community, and if it can't be out in the community, it could be online out in the community and people signposted to it. And certainly that's a way forward that I would see with the Art of the Troubles type collection that we would have. Alex, I just wanted to say that was brilliant, and thank you for that. And there's just so much actually within that I could comment on, and hopefully, maybe it's later on when we're talking about, what you want to bring to the minister. I have a few ideas there, but I just wanted to pick up a couple of things. I think one of the key issues is this drop in, drop out of communities, where there's been a pot of funding has allowed an artist in the broadest sense to engage with a community, and then the community is left after the artist is gone. Now, we have learned our lesson on that, and there are funders, etc., who do establish a longer term, and also, like, within our own context, we know that is just not the way how to build up that relationship. And as you said, with David and the Beat Carnival, it takes years to be able to engage with the communities, for them to trust with you. So that, that's why we keep going back to some of the communities that we have been working with continually to do this work. But again, then that's disadvantaging other communities. Some of the other things that I thought of, the feedback and the analysis of that. We are quite good in the museum world at how we look at feedback from consultation or even from our evaluation, and we look at very specific things like generic learning outcomes. So it is analysed quite deeply, and we obviously take all the stuff that we learn from that on board, and that's why we sort of put it back into the system as such. I think there could be something moving forward, like Anne has actually said as well, that all the things that they learnt through theatre of witness, there should be some sort of like toolkit, is the terms we use in the museum all the time. You can have toolkits for deaccessioning objects collection, but I think a toolkit that allows people to actually put forward meaningful evaluation forms or meaningful evaluation with groups of people, so that it's gathered and it's learnt and it's regurgitated back to the other organisations that want to do this art through reconciliation, or art of reconciliation, but or for reconciliation. And this is something that maybe is for later on, Peter, and please tell me that we'll discuss it later if this is not appropriate at this point. But I do think some sort of strategy, where does it actually sit? Okay, I don't think it sits with the grassroots organisations as such. I think it needs to come down from high. I think it sits above people like the Arts Council. It sits within the remit of the Department of Communities and other departments. And I'm assuming that the minister you're talking to is Deirdre Hargey, but I wasn't sure about that. But, to me, I think you have a very compelling case here for a strategy that, and I think you'll have, from my own dealings with her, I think you'll have a good ear there that would take on board a lot of the things that you've been saying, and that strategy, I think, should be sitting within the minister's department and then feeds through to the arm's length bodies to develop that. The last thing, sorry to go on, but just Alex really sort of piqued a lot of the things that I've been thinking about myself, and as an organisation. The idea of the Ulster University, and the idea of, Peter, you were maybe going to speak to Paul Seawright to see what was going to happen with the Troubles related database, etc., that they have, because it is quite a one-dimensional database, and I think there is a method of growing that to include all the amazing work that has been done by organisations across Northern Ireland and beyond with this reconciliation work. And just, it's a pity Paula McFetridge wasn't here, because again, she is quite vocal on this too, that we need to record everything. And I know that we were looking towards that ARHC, or no, sorry, the what was it, the collecting, what was it calling that we were working towards?
Discoveries. What was it?
All right, I do think that this needs to be put forward, that there's an expansion of a database that allows people to see the work that has been done, and to build on it, and it may be in partnership with the Ulster University and Queen's, etc. too, that that could be the next step of art for reconciliation. And I'm going to shut up now. Sorry.
I just pop in just really to echo what Anne and Kim said, but also to look at just something that Alex said about skills and how that's all developed. I don't think there's any kind of formal training or sort of building. I mean, Kim's talking about toolkits, and obviously Anne's talking a wider sort of sense about knowledge and engagement and things like that. But there is a sense that a lot of practitioners come to this work without any real training or grounding in what they're doing, or the languages and all that sort of stuff, and how evaluation works out, but also just working in that. I mean, if it is something that is worthy of a strategy, then perhaps part of that strategy can encompass skills, and how third level and FE and universities can and schools can kind of engage with that in a wider sense. I mean, obviously, training and skills in the arts in Northern Ireland can be a bit of a difficult subject at the best of times. I don't even know if we have a strategy in general for that. But if it is going to be a reconciliation strategy, then arts reconciliation strategy, then I think skills would be a priority.
Just to add to that is actually also having a conversation about what does reconciliation mean.
Yeah.
Because we have a thing in the Good Friday Agreement called parity of esteem and mutual respect, which should be the conceptual basis of how you build reconciliation. And one of the problems, I think there should be more strategy and development of the concept of reconciliation. But of course, our political masters don't agree on what reconciliation is.
I think coming back to Hugh there, and completely agree with what you're saying. A lot of us come in, but what I have found has been very helpful over the years has been little education programs, self-development programs, facilitation programs, leadership skills programs that all feed into rehumanizing the other, taking away labels and stuff like that, and all of that enhances then what it is we have to put forward. And that can come at an OCN level and stuff like that.
I think there's definitely stuff out there. I think it's more that kind of it's accessibility to those kind of courses. And if yes, I think Pete is right. There's a definitional problem around what reconciliation is and all that sort of stuff in our masters. But if we are going to talk about strategy, I think it's how do young freelance practitioners coming into this? I mean, I've been asked to do interface projects, and I've no real experience of that. During my career, 25, 30 years, whatever. I've no real experience of that. And if somebody's doing those kind of courses, is it just applied knowledge, or is there a kind of framework? Is there a kind of, a body of networks, all those kind of things that the training can build up for you?
I suppose before we move on, that's the concept of often for. Art does something different. Mm-hmm. What's it for? And if art can do things differently than other approaches, then it should have a strategy. Because
all art is useless, of course, as Oscar Wilde said.
Oh, we know that.
Anyway, sorry, talking about the facilitation of the work going forward, it's about getting people up with those facilitation type, understanding type, dropping the label type background skills, which are transferable across the board as well. And as I'm speaking to you, we're working with Training for Women's Network, who educate women all over Ireland, and they're taking on methodology from Theatre of Witness to help some of their women through their education. I'm also doing a training course with the Warrington Peace Centre, who are doing a Facing Up to the Future course, and there's actually 9 of those courses available out there. But it's those. How can we teach somebody a single story, or if we're coming from a single story? But when we break down our own single stories, to be able to envelop in everyone, no matter what situation we're going into, and whether we do that through drama, through arts, through education, and it's the basic or the skills courses, I think, better. And there's a lot of those type things out there. There's free education, online education, and literally just sharing knowledge about where these courses are available. Just basics, go back to basics. Yeah.
I think we take away from that the issue of a strategy, the issue of training, and the issue of how you socialize this more deeply into society and its benefits. So if we go to Polly now, just to keep the flow going, and of course I know you'll come back with more comments afterwards, and the Pauline's sitting there nervously. Joking.
I am. Okay, let's have a look. So I want to really look at really look at the question of policy, which is what we're going to talk about, and really, I suppose, to think about how our research could maybe translate into policy recommendations. And in particular, I'm really wanting to look at something that we've talked about in the research advisory committees, and the way I think that we need to have some kind of, Kim mentioned it just before, recollection and rediscovery of this historic arts practice, if we really are going to understand what it is and what its value is. And this really is very much tied into, though, what we've just been talking about and what Alex talked about. You know, how do we inform a really effective evaluation and, I would say, collections policy framework that would actually really be useful as a guide for future development of these funded projects. So just a quick recap then on the research findings, and this is maybe going back over some of the things that Alex mentioned, but I'm pulling them out because I think they're kind of important for the argument that we're putting forward. And that is that, you know, that the interviews really is where most of these, a lot of the findings I'm going to talk about came out of the interviews. And the interviews themselves are a great argument for an archive of art for reconciliation practice, because those 40 interviews that we collected themselves represent, I think, collectively, a really important and rich archive of that tells the history, and also the practice, talks about the practice of arts for reconciliation. So it's a really rich resource, and it tells you how much material is out there and what value it has. So basically, the research findings, just to recap on them, you can sum it up in one word: complexity. That this area of policy and practice is very complex. There are a lot of organizations, practitioners, different interest groups involved in developing all manner of artistic interventions. And Alex talked about quite a few of them, about the diversity of this field. And each of those projects has its own multiple objectives and goals. And art for reconciliation, both art and reconciliation, are often components of the work that's carried out by different organizations and funders. They're sometimes quite small components of that work, and not even their sole or primary agenda. And so, not surprisingly, you know, there is a sort of patchy, the data that's available is quite patchy. The data that's shared with funders and the data that's collected by funders really provides a very patchy kind of account of what is a very complex policy landscape. And the one thing that's missing, that's really noticeable in its absence, is the gap in practitioner knowledge and participant experience in the official record. And I think that this perhaps explains really the problem of why there's such a lack of clarity around the definition of scope, the scope and the aims of art for reconciliation. It is the complexity of the field and the gaps in data and knowledge that's being collected. The other thing we discovered were some really interesting patterns of conflict and convergence which really just came out of the interviews. And actually, Alex and Sarah and I have written an academic paper, article, which really goes into some of this in much more detail. And we'd love to come over and talk to you about that, actually, and maybe get a discussion going around those findings that we put in the paper. These patterns of conflict and convergence really are interesting. The presumption that the arts are able to deliver reconciliatory outcomes is absolutely embedded in political and institutional systems of thought and in the common sense of everyone involved in this field, from the political to the practitioner, the professional, and the policy actors. And yet, in spite of widespread agreement on the value of the arts as a driver of reconciliation, there is a striking divergence on the question of how this value might be realized, documented, and measured in practice. people just generally describe quite different ways of different values they place on it. And our article really goes into this in depth and looks at this really rich resource in the interviews, which I can't go into in such depth here, except to say that there's all sorts of conflicting dynamics and points of convergence and conflict in the way people talk about art and reconciliation. One of the big things that came up really is everyone seemed to agree that these processes are multifaceted and that they're built up over time through an accumulation of creative encounters and exchanges. And everyone agreed that bureaucratic systems for measuring, collecting evidence on the effectiveness of these projects tend to simplify evaluation processes so that they you create a kind of one size fits all across a whole range of different contexts. Everyone seemed to sort of agree that outcomes-based evaluations, that this was much stronger, I think, obviously in the arts managers, development managers and practitioners, that outcomes-based evaluations that prioritize compliance, efficiency, value for money, actually act as a structural constraint, holding back imaginative approaches to developing and evaluating arts projects. And also that this frequently results in the exclusion of practitioner knowledge that might link reconciliatory outcomes to specific artistic strategies, techniques, and practices. So you lose the specificity in the evaluation because it's kind of standardized evaluation. Another really interesting, I think really intriguing finding that came out of the interviews is that there are this kind of twin track evaluation processes go on. So on the one hand, evaluations are seen as an audit of measurable, social economic outputs, costs, outcomes that can be measured quantitatively. But there's another kind of evaluation, and that is a more reflexive process in which creative teams and audiences step away from their work to examine and reflect upon their experiences and what they've learned. And we refer to them in our article really as surreptitious processes of practitioner-led evaluation, learning and capacity building, which are largely left out of the reports that go into the official record, the official archive, if you like. And yet, these actually could provide the sector with a rich pool of knowledge about the value and practice of art for reconciliation. So this amazing record, which is conducted almost off the grid or surreptitiously, remains largely invisible and dispersed. This critical knowledge is often consigned to backrooms and informal conversations, but we were delighted to capture some of that knowledge in our interviews. We also, I think, identified quite a lot of convergence, widespread agreement on the need to prioritize longer term and experiential evaluation. So you're kind of pushing at an open door because everyone wants much more, everyone sees the shortcomings of existing systems of evaluation. And there's also widespread convergence really around, or acknowledgement that it's actually the failure to invest in core activities that has led to this, that the difficulties of sustaining long-term evaluation are actually very, very closely linked to the limited funding available for core activities and to the short-term nature of funding periods, so project funding as opposed to investment in core activities. And that the funding, it's not that there isn't data being collected, it's that the quality of the data perhaps isn't really helping us understand the practice. And it also really eats up a lot of time and absorbs quite a lot of precious resources that leave very little time for experimentation and actually have worked against the development of long-term change and innovation. So just to sort of think about some of the interpretations that we put on this, I think we saw a correspondence with broader UK experience, where you have kind of what you would call instrumental approaches, which give rise to a whole load of assumptions about the potential benefits of the arts in social and economic, to affect social and economic change. And the arts, in a sense, are sort of taken for granted in that sense. It's not the main event. That there's much more emphasis on what they can achieve and measuring the art against the achievement of instrumental outcomes. And obviously in Northern Ireland, it's no surprise that the benefits of participation in the arts has converged with regional policy objectives for mitigating and transforming conflict. Another thing that's a sort of tendency that I think that we've discovered is that where everyone knows there's weaknesses in, say, evaluation processes and lots of other policy weaknesses that might exist, but nobody really wants to confront it. And over again, this was actually came out of some of the literature we looked at as well of previous research projects. People tend to skirt around problems and try and fix them rather than confront them. And so the gaps in accessible, relevant data that's collected by evaluations is kind of an open secret in the sector, but nobody really wants to grasp the nettle and deal with it. And what you find is a tendency towards repetition, a preference for tried and trusted projects and organizations, a tendency towards or a desire for kind of more predictable, safe outcomes. In other words, you're looking for projects and for evidence and evaluations that will kind of support the system as it is rather than challenge it. So you're not looking for failures, you're not looking for problems. The evaluation process will often sort of smooth those away in order to present something that is that's going to kind of work with the system rather than rock the boat. And this really leads to a situation where actual problems and policy weakness simply become entrenched because people just do them over and over again. And the emphasis then on achieving these predestined outcomes, these safe outcomes, and for organizations to prove their reliability has simply fueled demand for more and more evidence that simply reinforces more and more existing assumptions and further entrenches problems. So there is a need then to actually use evaluation systems to do what they're supposed to do, which is to actually look at things honestly and try and understand their shortcomings as well as their values. But that's not what we've seen. So to summarize, in an output driven environment, the emphasis on measuring efficiency and value for money has failed to document the complex ways arts practitioners, participants and audiences experience different art practices developed in response to conflict in Northern Ireland. And this failure over a long period of time has fueled a loss of historical and institutional memory. And this is, I think, really important to grasp that in a way, in terms of actually dealing with this problem, it is now or never. Funders, managers, practitioners, many of people are actually retiring, they're coming to the end of their career. In some cases, people have come, we've found, people have worked as practitioners have come to the end of their lives. And the knowledge, the practitioner knowledge that they have has gone. I think also it's trying to understand as well, I think what we've discovered, a link between the way art for reconciliation practice is developed and the way it's documented and evaluated. There is a link, an important link. And I think that's an important area for future research. However, immediately, I think what we've talked about, all of us in the Research Advisory Committee meetings, and I think what has shone out of this research as it's gone along, is that the lack of a comprehensive art for reconciliation archive, a comprehensive one, and not just one that records how many people, how much it cost, and where it took place, presents a significant obstacle for any long-term assessment of its contribution to reconciliation. And that means that actually, I would say, presents a significant obstacle to developing an effective evaluation policy framework, which is why I think the evaluation and collections policy framework actually should go together. The question then would be really good to discuss is how can we challenge the amnesiac effects of outcomes-based evaluation, particularly this sort of emphasis on quantitative forms of measurement. How many, how much, was it value for money? And I think the argument that I think we've been putting as part of the Research Advisory Committee that's come very strongly is the need to recover those aspects of art for reconciliation practice that such methods of documentation really have tended to forget. And I think the process of recontextualization really would allow us to disentangle art for reconciliation practices from the relations of and structures of power that they're currently embedded in. And it's not just about recovering an important and valuable asset, regional asset, but actually trying to, by recontextualizing it, I think we can make sense of how it works, not just its value, but how it works. And I think that will help us understand. That's why I link it to an evaluation framework. If we can understand how it works and how certain voices are being lost and how this gap has arisen in our understanding and our official record of something that is so valuable. I think if we can disentangle that, then we will have a much clearer idea of how we can develop an effective policy and for the future development of art for reconciliation. And that's where I'd like to end.
Okay, have we any initial comments or queries for Pauline, please?
Have.
Go for you.
Yeah, I was thinking, Pauline.
You want to take it down, Pauline?
Yeah, take it down. Sorry, of course.
I was thinking one of your initial statements about the interviews, creating a rich resource, an archive. Would it be worth looking at extending that and systematically interviewing and keeping and recording more and more interviews, and then having someone look at all those and correlate what works together? Would it be worth getting an archive of interviews of all the different artists and from different backgrounds?
Yeah, I think that what's missing, I mean, yeah, I think the interviews that we've collected, I mean, I think are astonishingly rich. It's probably one of the, the most, I called it an archive because it is actually a collection of interviews. And in a sense, why they were so important was they did act as a bridge. So, you can look at the map, you can map the funding landscape, you can look at the work that's produced, and you can place a value on that and try to work out what its value is in terms of whether it meets certain objectives and policy objectives. But what the interviews actually did was provide a sort of bridge between those two processes. And they did so because what people talked about largely was the practice and the practical experience. So it was all about practice. And I think that is the area that when I think about recovering, it's recovering practices. And so therefore, yes, I think that collecting more interviews is part of it, and perhaps also the collections themselves, which we talked about. Where is this work held? We don't know where a lot of it is. We do know where some of it is, but it's quite dispersed. And wouldn't it be great if we could create a bridge to bring it back together? And if the people who actually created that work and developed it and experienced that work could be part of the process.
Just to go on the back of, again, Pauline, fantastic. I totally agree with your summary. I totally agree with the sort of outputs of future looking as well. But just as you were saying there, as Anne said about continuing those interviews, which I think is really important. Yes, the interviews are mostly with practitioners, as far as I'm aware, or artists themselves. It'd be really good to have interviews with the participants on how some of the projects actually transform them or their thinking, in a peace building or post-conflict scenario as well. So that, I would imagine there's been a lot of useful future projects that actually have probably not involved arts or arts agencies in any shape or form, that may have come out of the initial project that have been done through organisations across Northern Ireland. So,
yeah, and on that note, actually, Kim, I think that Alex or David or Pete could probably answer this or respond to this, but the case study section of the research, which we haven't really touched on today, we haven't really gone into that in great depth, or at least I haven't so much. I've really focused on the interviews from the phase 1, the early phases, but I think the case studies, I'd be right in saying, Alex, wouldn't I, that actually do look and have written about the audiences and participants.
Yeah. I'm in the process of writing up a paper on, which is and I interviewed Anne for it, or David and I interviewed Anne and others who had participated in Theatre of Witness, and it was kind of doing precisely that, mapping out the relationship between this project and its impact on participants and what participants ended up doing in other forms of peace building. And it's a very, we talk about amplification, and you only need a few people really to take what they've learned into other arenas, really to amplify the lessons of an individual art for reconciliation project. And Anne's work really shows that, and the work of other former participants in Theatre of Witness shows how that ripple effect actually kind of maps out. But also we kind of think about it in structural terms as well, of course, because you exit one space where you have material support, and then you're out into a different context where you face all sorts of challenges to actually amplifying art for reconciliation. So this is why I've touched on in my paper very briefly, the need to think in a broader structure of peace building, so where this fits into.
If I could just chip in there, Alex, I think the Queer Ceilidh Kibosh project, which was one of our case studies, and the Don't Shoot Your Waynes, the project up in Derry, were both very much, the audience dimension of those were very important, and we tried to gather data on those. But when we were reviewing it all, we were conscious that the formal evaluations for funders very often place almost all the focus on the audiences. And in some ways, we actually felt it was the practitioner perspective that was the least recognised in terms of traditional formal evaluations, funders' accountability evaluations, as I think of them. So that partly explains, I think, the emphasis on the practitioner perspective, because we felt that's one of the big gaps in the record.
Oh yes, hi, and thanks very much indeed. That was fantastic, and there's an awful lot to take on board there. So I'll keep my comments quite short, but just to, I suppose, reiterate some of the points that were already made about targeting the research that you've undertaken. I think DFC would be a good starting point, particularly given their ambition to develop a cultural strategy. I'm not sure where they are in that process, but in terms of highlighting the issues you've mentioned here, I think it's particularly timely. From my perspective, I see an increased recognition in terms of just an understanding of just how important the arts is as a way of addressing some of these issues. So hopefully that will play into the design of new evaluation frameworks where we're not just having to demonstrate the value of the art within these contexts, but sort of moving beyond that focus. I'm interested, I suppose, in terms of trying to unpack the distinction between process evaluation within an arts context and also outcome and impact. I'm not sure which of the two we're trying to do here. I mean, in terms of process, there's a recognition of as I was mentioning, of just the increased value of the arts in this. So we don't have to demonstrate that as a mechanism. It's as effective, I hope, because there's an understanding that it is. And I suppose just in terms of outcome and impact, from our perspective, if you're looking at a logic model and you're moving towards that right-hand side, it's often more difficult to attribute outcomes to a specific intervention. And there's an increased cost involved in achieving that, if you like, if you're employing a consultant. So trying to square that circle of attribution or demonstrating sufficient attribution and an evaluation framework which is able to do that, I think is one of the key challenges. And I suppose moving on from that point, some more embedded longitudinal evaluation, which is building a coherent evidence base, drawing on both qualitative and quantitative evidence, I think for me certainly is the way ahead. And I think there's an increasing focus on the richness of the narrative in this area, even within a government context, which is really encouraging to see, where there's an understanding of just how important observations are and reflections are by participants on engagement in these types of projects, is particularly impactful when we're presenting evidence, for example, to the executive office. So I definitely see where the issues have been in the past. I mean, just pulling out, individual pieces of evidence rather than looking at things in the round and on the whole is certainly a fair criticism to make. But often there is, certainly from my experience, an ambition to triangulate the evidence in a way that it reflects the intervention. If that hasn't been the case, then that's obviously a failing. But moving forward, I'll be quite optimistic. But the work you've done here is tremendous in terms of, providing a platform for creating evaluation and monitoring systems which are more effective and more attuned to the work that is done within the communities. I'll stop ranting there, but thank you very much again.
I can say
can I
something.
just ask something there, Graham? I don't know you. Where are you coming from in this?
So I work at the Arts Council in the Strategic Development Department.
Okay.
If I can say something, what proves the point of all of the things that have been said is we set out with this very simple question, which turned out to be a very complex process. can you evaluate or monitor or account for long-term art for reconciliation strategies? And the answer to that was no, unless you actually dig in to, as been shown here today, funding records, extensive body of research. So you have this thing that's been funded in different ways, but you understand that's fragmented. Of course, we accept that. But nobody in the funding sector had ever thought to say, what has this been for? What has it achieved? So the value of it is lost. So if I turn around and said, since they set up the assembly in 1998, how much have they spent on roads? Somebody would come back and say, $500 million. If I said, how much have you spent in the hospital? Somebody would come back and say, 20 billion. If you say, how much have you spent in art for reconciliation? No idea. Okay, and that illustrates the point. So therefore, the point you're saying at the end is clearly there's a lobbying aspect here, because you want to affect within policy that this is actually an agenda item. It's not something that's lost in a cultural policy or a cultural arena, that it's something which is, it's that point that Alex made about neoliberal. They can tell you how much was spent in this, that, and the other, but they can't tell you how much was spent in reconciliation. So there's something wrong if you don't know the answer to how much, or roughly you can guess. Work that out. David Boyd, you haven't spoken yet. Have you got anything?
Yeah, well, yeah. First of all, I entirely missed Alex's presentation. I had the 2:30 time in my calendar. I didn't update it to 2 o'clock, so I'll speak to Pauline and see if I can get a copy of that. And then my internet disappeared during Pauline's presentation. But what I heard Pauline saying, everything completely hit the nail on the head. And then just in relation to what you were saying there, Peter, I think that's it. It's how is it used? And we need to have the archives that are being talked about, and we need to use them for the future. But it's not as if we don't have any archive, which I think is what you're saying. It's not as if none of this work has been done. But what is really sad, I think, at the moment is that still bodies like Belfast City Council are reinventing the wheel. They're talking as if nothing had ever happened. And a current example is this idea of co-design. They're talking about co-design and employing consultants to look into it as if it had never happened for decades. And they're saying, does anybody know anybody who does this? So this, I think there needs to be some work done on how to use archives. It's not just about building the archives, but it's how to use it, how to get them out there, why it's valuable. Arts Council has never ever talked to us about any of our reconciliation. Nobody has ever in all the years talked to us about the reconciliation work that we do, why it works, how it works, what the benefits are. So there's really got to be something done so that the senior managers and people in the agencies, the local authorities, know how to deal with this business, because it's just you can collect everything, do all the work that's been talked about. Say Pauline was 100% spot on, but how's it going to be used is my concern, because I see it not being used. And both Arts Council and City Council have vaults full of archive material, and it doesn't get, that would be a start.
Well, that's the point. It's a fair, it's the point we're trying to get across, David, is there's no point doing research unless it has impact. And we've clearly found issues here that need to have impact to them, need to have impact applied to them. So, that's the challenge. We have a minister we have a meeting with the minister with the meeting. We have a meeting with the minister, which is only half an hour. We'll do our best there. But what this is about today is, well, we'll take that research, and we have to make that into policy documents. We have to put that in the next 8 weeks into things that are usable. So more people can give us ideas. Sorry, Paul. The more people can give us ideas today, the better. And we'll come back, obviously, to you over the next 8 weeks. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Pete, as well. Apologies. I'm having to elbow. I can't find the little hand thing, so I can't put my hand up. Sorry. But what I wanted to say was, the value of the archive as well, in answer to what David asked, about, there are collections and there's data and there's all sorts of stuff all over the place. But I think what we were saying, it's in back rooms, it's in people's heads, some of it's in recorded and official data, collections of data, but it's this kind of dispersed nature of it. And the value of the archive is actually that there's a huge amount of information and a huge amount of practitioner knowledge and participant experience out there, right, just there. And it's dispersed, it's all over the place. And I think in assembling it and recollecting it, we are then it becomes a resource that you can use, that you can learn from, and it will inform an effective strategy, an evaluation strategy.
I
think that's the argument for it.
Can I jump in there just to say, as someone with experience, obviously, in the 2000s of running an archive specifically about performing arts at the London Library, which is theatre performing arts archive, it is a great thing to build, and the work that Ophelia Byrne did in building that in the late 90s through the Community Relations Council. But it really wasn't supported institutionally or by funders. The Arts Council gave us some funding minimally, and in the last few years we worked as part of the developing John Boyd's work and things like that. It was a big project though, and there was a huge skills project attached to it and all that sort of stuff. But it is built, or the archival work in terms of performing arts or in performance culture in Northern Ireland tends to be at the fringes of institutional work by Queen's or University of Ulster and so on, or the Lindhall Library, which, as you all know, haven't really a penny to rub together and are just trying to keep the doors open as much as they can. Arts Council, Belfast City Council, Derry Council, all these kind of institutions pay lip service to the past and that sort of stuff, but the actual investment that is required to build an archive that can actually work, but also be useful to the community for which is funding it, has never been there, and there never seems to have been that kind of impulse from our funders. So I remember being at a meeting of the Arts Council when the Lindhall rang me to tell me that we were getting our funding cut the next year. There are kind of we have been down this road before, is what I mean. And if the DFC are going to do anything, then it needs to be a sort of a long-term commitment to it, because it does get lost very easily. And Kim will know, you know what I mean? These collections disappear.
And I suppose I just want to throw out a suggestion, an idea that came into my head when we were listening to these all, is how would you feel about participating in a theatre of witness true narrative workshop to see if there was transferable skills, so we could create something similar as on a human level, as like a sort of a narrative workshop that we can take to the relevant people, rather than just document after document, but something that could be added on. But it might be interesting for you all to see the true narrative workshop, just to see how it impacts on a human level, and if it's something that we could use moving forward to push what we're trying to do here. If it's of interest, you let me know. I can set it up and have it organised in a week or so, get everybody on.
And just to sort of come back in on the collections issue, the phrase that came up most when we were writing our article, actually Polly and I were writing this article, was memory hold. And it feels like a lot of the work, even though it is collected or recorded or documented, people do it, do all the things they're supposed to do to keep the material, and it doesn't get used as David said. The archive becomes a way of memory holding a lot of work. And so, yes, we need to think very carefully about how, in rejoining and recontextualizing this work from various disparate locations and various disparate repositories, that we think about ways to present it, which is kind of why, unfortunately, our big grant didn't get put through this time. But one of the reasons we applied for this, I think it was around £3 million, was because half of that was built towards was presentation, essentially, and accessibility. And I think at the moment the biggest issue is it may be collected, but it's not presented in a way that is accessible and useful to the groups that we want to be, targeting. And that's educationalists, that's facilitators, and funders as well. What does historical practice look like? Can we locate historical projects in this area of the North? Can we organize things by issue, or by geographical context? So there are ways of presenting historical practice that would be so useful for researchers and for funders and for practitioners. It's just not possible to do at the moment, and it requires, as Hugh correctly says, it requires proper funding to do it, I think, for it to be sustainable. So, I mean, this comes back to lobbying, basically, and getting the right people in the room and putting together a bid for some funding. And, that's what has been so fantastic about the last couple of years for me personally, is getting people from all, researchers and practitioners and funders all in the same room to talk about these problems, because that very rarely happens. I feel like it very rarely happens. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems quite rare occurrence.
Alex, it doesn't happen, and that's the problem, because, if this group of people had been, thinking strategically, and we're all quite long in the tooth when it comes to our work with communities and the issues that in a post-conflict society, but we would have been trying to record it. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier was, I think we need to have a strong lobbying, but there is infrastructure there that can help us already. I mean, the Keane Archive was going to go down the chute, and now it's revived somewhat. It's known across the world. The rise of a post-conflict research international base, it grows. I mean, I get contacted by PhD people from all over the place. So I think that if we were to move forward as a group of people together, that the academics, through the universities, not only do you have something to build on, you have the ability for them to actually develop the infrastructure as well, so that the costs involved wouldn't be enormous as such, but they could be in-house, and each university bringing their expertise in different areas. But also the Arts Council database, okay, it was put on hold, and I know Ken's not here today, but there's a lot of material there about all the arts that could be siphoned or amalgamated into something like Keane. I think Keane, again, is a very old-fashioned type interface and not particularly user-friendly nor attractive visually. Okay, the curator in me, but I think that something could be developed that actually combines both that historical facts and issues about the Troubles with the art practice that evolved and continued after what has happened in the society. So just a thought.
Right, we've come to the end of our time. Is there anybody who's anything else? So this was a kickoff for this conversation. Okay, we're not going to get all the answers today, and clearly it's food for thought, hopefully, and people can go away and have some thoughts about what we can do here through your support of our project to do the next iteration of it, which is impact and hopefully influence. And that's not going to happen in the next 68 weeks, but we can most certainly have a good stab at it. So is anybody anything immediate they want to say before we draw stumps? Another form of culture?
I hope this doesn't sound silly, but I wonder, is there a way that we, the practitioners in this group, could get help to look at how we in our organisations do approach archive and better collect information and so on, maybe as a separate project? I'm just saying this group because it's just small, it's maybe manageable.
David, one of the things we actually have, which are very few of left in Britain, is in our university we have an archive department who actually teach archive studies. So if Pauline and Alex remind me, because I've got a head like a sieve, we could maybe we have worked with them on some other projects and ideas. So it might be an idea just for them maybe to come in if we can get them to do it and just do the basics and help you start that conversation. Is that okay?
I would like that.
David, we could also help with some of the evaluation that we do, which is much more qualitative as opposed to quantitative. If you want to touch base with me, I can pull out some stuff that relates. It is relating to exhibitions, but it could obviously be adapted for events, etc. The one thing that I was going to say, Peter, when you are meeting with the minister, and I'm sure you're thinking along these lines anyway, but you as the Institute of Irish Studies at the University of Liverpool, I think you really need to up your engaged, let the minister know how much you've been engaged with the organisations that are sitting around this table and the ones that are missing, because she is very acute, about the cross-community aspect, and also the fact that you've done so much work with ourselves. I mean, that all of us.
I think when you're talking to ministers and you know what their backgrounds is, there's some, of course, from certain political parties for which community, and having engaged with community is very, very important. And for others, actually, it's the opposite. But anyway, no, don't worry, Kim. I'm not too shy.
No, I just thought, because
no, it's a good point. I was conscious of that.
And also, please don't call it the markets, or you get shut down. She's a definite the market woman.
It even was mentioned this morning when Alex and I were speaking with, and Pauline and I were speaking. Is the importance of making it clear that this has come from within communities and multiple sectors, personalities, and all of that.
No, and you've got so many big hitters around the table as well that her department are funding, and the fact that this is maybe the first time that we've all started to talk to each other will be a huge plus point from her point of view.
See, we always bring the people together. That's good. That's a good point. Very good point. Yeah, thank you. Anybody else for any more advice? We take advice. We also take criticism. Not very much, but we will take a bit. We do take criticism as well. So anybody for any more, or shall we go away and have a good think and then come back to you?
Just wanted to say thank you to everyone for engaging so in such a sustained way with this. It's been very...
Well, Kim's point I hadn't really thought about, which has got a lot of power in it, which is that we had actually brought, this is the first time all of this people came together in this way. So that's I hadn't really thought about that. Sometimes you're doing things, you don't realise the significance of what you're doing.
I mean, we all talk individually to each other for different things, including these reconciliation projects, but we've never had a forum with as many people sitting around giving their 10 pence worth about how we should be moving this forward.
Excellent. Well, that's a moment of that's something to be proud of, if anything else, or pleased with. Maybe.
Thanks, Pauline and Alex, as well, for great presentations.
Yeah, very good.
Here and
thank
really
you.
good to see you. Hopefully we'll be able to catch up when we're over next month.
Okay, well, we've fallen into a loving. So if anybody's no more critical comments or points, then we will let you go and enjoy whatever's left of it's just been grey here now. But anyway, we'll let you go and enjoy the rest of the day. But thank you very much to Alex and Pauline, who have been wonderful colleagues and brought so much to the project, and for yourselves who've also helped. And thank you for your support and enthusiasm. And we will do our best not to let you down.
no problem.
Thank you.
See you next month.
Thank you very much, everybody. You're very much appreciated. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye now. Bye.